First of all, we're going to call our all-in guys that we are all in on. And I would say this. We're all in, especially relative to where others might rank them and where maybe the expectations are for them this season. I'll begin, and I think this is probably the player that Matthew and I have been the most divisive on so far this preseason in terms of where we have him ranked. I continue to note that Dak Prescott is one of the most efficient quarterbacks in football who has as many avenues to fantasy relevance as I believe almost anybody in the NFL at quarterback. He has 3+ passing touchdowns or a rushing touchdown in 56.3% of his career games. Of course, he's played 2 seasons, so you're talking about a relatively small sample size, but he's also second to only Tom Brady in QBR over the past 2 seasons. And the best argument I've heard against Dak Prescott, or the most common one that I've heard against Dak Prescott this year, is that the pass catchers around him are simply not as good as last year. If we go back, and we're going to go back and reflect upon the 2017 Cowboys season, it won't take us long to realize that Dak Prescott was not playing with a bunch of all-stars. He was playing with a Dez Bryant who can't find a job right now. He was playing with Jason Witten, our new teammate, who was reliable but not an explosive play option. I don't think the downgrades are that significant. I still have Dak Prescott as my quarterback 11.
My biggest worry is the offensive line. And just that if he gets into trouble, now he is able to move well. I mean, no doubt he's scored rushing touchdowns, and that's been part of what he's been able to do to give you fantasy points. But I don't know. Even just watching that preseason game, I don't know who they're going to have up front and how that's going to look. And I do think that impacts him if he has to rush more, make decisions more quickly with a less familiar pass catching group. It just makes me nervous relative to other quarterbacks that are available.
It's really, for me, what you're banking on, because it's a team that's in the bottom 12 in terms of total plays. It's a fairly slow offense. And it is, I believe, they're 30th in pass attempts over the past 2 years. Like, it's not a very high volume offense. Honestly, Dak Prescott's fantasy value has come from his rushing, right? I mean, he's got the same number of touchdown passes the last 2 years as Eli Manning. That's what we're dealing with here. We're dealing with Eli, right? Touchdown passing wise. So it's just his rushing, and just whether you could believe he's had 6 rushing touchdowns each of the last 2 years. The argument I've always used is that if you look closer at those 6 rushing touchdowns, 4 of those field came from 10 yards or more out. It is hard to run for a touchdown from 10 yards out or more, especially 4 times, especially when you're a quarterback. He led the NFL. No one had more. He was tied for the NFL lead. And for me, I just feel like there's got to be some regression there. He's got more rushing touchdowns over the last 2 years than Derrick Henry.
Right.
I mean,
Derrick Henry's backup running back for the past 2 years, which might make more sense. I'm moving along to my second, and this is a 2-for-1 special, if you will. Yeah. One of the biggest question marks leading into this upcoming season. That's right. One of the biggest question marks moving into this season has been who will catch passes for the Patriots at wide receiver. Well, the answer we know for the first 4 weeks is not Julian Edelman, as he is suspended for that time. But I do believe that Chris Hogan and Julian Edelman will prove to be some of the best values in your draft this year. I've got Hogan at 18, highest amongst the rankers here at ESPN, and 7 slots higher than his ADP. I'm also highest on Edelman at 34. Matthew, you and I are 9 slots apart there. I would just say this, that if you take into account the 4 weeks that Hogan will have as the unquestioned number 1 wide receiver, plus the role that he will have as the Patriots' number 2 wide receiver, there's so much volume, especially in the red zone, as we saw last year when in the first 8 games that he played, he had 11 red zone targets. That was tied for 4th in the NFL. And a reminder, Julian Edelman is Tom Brady's best friend off the field and best friend on the field. He was targeted on 28.2% of his routes in 2016, 3rd highest amongst wide receivers that year. Obviously, he missed last year. Does not look like a player that I think has shown much wear and tear this preseason with his ACL injury. And I just believe the volume is going to be so significant. The Patriots felt comfortable, given the relative lack of depth, trading away Brandon Cooks this offseason. Part of the reason why is Julian Edelman will feast.
So, first off, 100% with you on Chris Hogan. He made my love list. He's candidly, if you hadn't picked him for this, he would have been one of my players, one of my all-in players as well. I could not agree more on Chris Hogan, who we did a thing on him yesterday on the Fantasy Show on ESPN Plus. By the way, I'm a company man. prior to his injury, he was a top 10 fantasy wide receiver, and he was leading the Patriots in red zone targets. I mean, they were looking for him more in the red zone than Rob Gronkowski. So I'm with you 100% on Chris Hogan. I like Edelman as well. I'm lower than you, as you mentioned. I'm lower than you. My only concern on Edelman is both obviously the 4-game suspension, the injury history, and the lack of touchdowns. Like he's a very solid PPR player. I actually have him. I did that Scott Fishbowl. He's actually one of my wide receivers in the Scott Fishbowl. But Stephania, that's the concern, is all the injuries he's dealt with throughout his career. I
think it's fair. I mean, he gets banged up going across the middle a lot, and that's the risk that you take. But volume-wise, I agree with Field in terms of volume.
Yeah, 100%. And he's going so late in drafts. I definitely like where he's going at his price point.
Last one for me is Joe Mixon. The Bengals running back enters his second season. We often see that major jump for players, and his relatively average rookie year was a bit overlooked last year because so many good rookie running backs that we forgot that Joe Mixon was there and really just average. But there were some encouraging signs if you look closer, despite the overall lack of production. He had 17 goal-to-go rushes last season. The rest of the Bengals roster combined for 5, so he dominated the goal-to-go touches. He had 7 of their 8 rushing attempts from inside the 5-yard line. He's an effective player in the passing game. 30 catches last year. Wouldn't surprise me if that number ballooned to 40. And last thing I'll say here is Jeremy Hill was there. He was a factor for the first, 5 or 6 games last year before he eventually landed on IR. And not that Jeremy Hill was playing well, but the fact that he was playing chewed into Joe Mixon's value. I get it. The raw total preseason numbers this year have not been great for Joe Mixon, and the offensive line's a concern, but I'm all in on him as a breakout candidate this season.
I like that call. I mean, they're committed to him. Volume should be key in theory. The Bengals' offensive line should be better than it was last year. He looked like a better running back towards the second half of last season, so I'm with you on Joe Mixon.
Here's a poll that came on the Twitter handle last night, I believe last night. It asked, who will score more points this season, Dak Prescott or Alex Smith? Alex Smith wins in resounding fashion, 78% of the votes. And the reasons why we asked this question was that when we begin Matthew's all-in players, the first one you have is Alex Smith.
Yeah, so a lot of the things, I have him ranked 11th. His current ADP is 15th. Field, you and Stephania are slightly lower than the ADP. Look, he's a guy that has a high floor because of his rushing, right? So, last 3 seasons, 5th most rushing yards by a quarterback. He's going to a fantasy-friendly offense. Last 3 seasons, Jay Gruden's offenses have been 6th in fantasy points by quarterback. And so Kirk Cousins is another guy that's always outperformed his ADP. I love this stat. Thirsty Kyle found this. Over the past 2 seasons, Alex Smith has scored at least 15 points. At least 15 points in 60% of his starts. That is a better percentage than Russell Wilson, Phillip Rivers, or Cam Newton. To give you a comparison, there's just a high floor there. And so for a guy that's currently going as quarterback 15, who last year was a top 5 fantasy quarterback, I get it, the track record isn't there, and he's changing teams. But yeah, I mean, whatever you think of Jay Gruden, they throw the ball. They're going to score points. They always have, the Redskins.
They are.
So it's always been a good offense. The defense is an issue, but the offense has always put up points.
My concern on Alex Smith, I'll just make it simple here, is that he let it rip last year in Kansas City. He really let it rip. And keep in mind that he had a rush of, 70 or 80 yards last year. That can really inflate a quarterback's rushing total for the season. One outlier run. So I'm a little bit less inclined.
But he's a mobile quarterback.
He is, no doubt about it. I'm just saying that that number can be a little bit inflated with just one play. I don't dislike Alex Smith, but there's great depth at quarterback. I find players with higher upside. Another player that was recently discussed on the podcast, Matthew, was Amari Cooper. 4th-year wide receiver now for the Oakland Raiders, and I was thinking about this when Odell Beckham Jr. signed his contract recently. Who's the next up amongst great wide receivers, or at least could be great wide receivers? Amari Cooper's got a lot to play for, not just in terms of on the football field, but in terms of his bank account as well.
Yeah, I mean, and this probably goes back to a little bit of how you feel about Jordy Nelson, and I'm not high on Jordy Nelson this particular year. I think Amari Cooper is going to be the guy. John Gruden has had a 1,000-yard receiver in every single season he's been an NFL coach. He's talked about the fact that Amari Cooper is going to be the focal point of this offense, still just 24 years old. He's a guy that when he has gotten, I feel like a lot of the negative on Amari Cooper is because he was drafted so high last year and failed to live up to it. It was a bad year for Amari for fantasy-wise. It was a bad year for Derek Carr. It was a bad year for the offense. It's one of the reasons why they've got a coaching change there and a whole new staff. But Amari Cooper, in his 22 career games with 8 or more targets, he averages 18 fantasy points a game. In 13 career games with 10 or more targets, he averages over 21 fantasy points per game. It is not hard to imagine him getting 8 to 10 targets a game when you look at the kind of offense around him. Still just 24 years old, at least 5 touchdowns each of the past 3 seasons. He's one of 7 receivers that can say that.
I'm
no Michael Crabtree.
I'm not worried about the targets. I'm worried about the actual catches. I mean, the field thing with Amari Cooper is I feel like he has these games where he's spectacular, and you see these flashes of it. We even see it in the preseason. And then you have these other games where it's droppity, drop, and then there's just this lack of productivity. I'm not worried about the ball coming his way. I think that could only potentially increase this year, but I just need to see the performance.
Drops are an issue, there's no question, but
right.
Yeah.
Sometimes when we make the case against a player, it's really not against that player. It's more in favor of others. And wide receivers that I have ranked just ahead of Amari Cooper include the likes of Demaryius Thomas, Stephon Diggs, Jarvis Landry, who I almost made my all-in player for this year, and Chris Hogan as well. Last one for you, Matthew, was a familiar running back who we have shared a lot of optimism about on this podcast.
Christian McCaffrey. So I did yesterday, once again, on the fantasy show on ESPN+. I'm a company man. ESPN Plus, by the way, merging with ESPN Insider no more.
Yeah, it's cool.
If you want a year of ESPN Plus, you can just subscribe to rotopass.com. Use the promo code PLUS for 10% off. PLUS to celebrate that. Very excited about that. So you can watch the show and get it for free if you subscribe to RotoPass, and you get all sorts of great insider content as well. But anyway, on that show, Field, we did a bold prediction segment, and one of my bold predictions was that Christian McCaffrey would be the #1 running back in fantasy this year.
Nice.
Again, it's a bold prediction, but we've seen the usage.
But it's not whoa, crazy.
I don't think it's whoa, crazy. I mean, the idea of a bold prediction is something that is unlikely to happen, but within the realm of possibility. And I think it is unlikely that Christian McCaffrey is the #1 running back in fantasy this year, but I think it is within the realm of possibility, Field. Remember, this is a guy that was 4th in the NFL in terms of fantasy points per touch last season, with, I believe, 1.16. If he gets 28 touches a game,
right, which won't happen.
I mean, he got 14 touches in the first half of a preseason game.
Sure.
But so he's not going to get 28 touches a game. But again, like if he gets 13 touches a game at 1.16, he's the 4th best running back in fantasy last year.
Right.
So it's just a guy that was getting tons of first team snaps. They seem committed to using him as a workhorse bass. Remember last year, weeks 9 through 17, he averaged 4.68 yards per carry. Seemed to get used to being an NFL running back, going between the tackles here. Honestly, I think a monster year is coming for Christian McCaffrey and Norv Turner's offense. C.J. Anderson seems like just an afterthought.
I don't disagree with the idea that a monster year is headed for Christian McCaffrey. The only thing that concerns me about his ability to have a monster season, and we're talking like I think he has top 5 potential, maybe not top 1 potential, is just how many yards can he bang between the tackles versus other players like David Johnson and Todd Gurley and Leonard Fournette that are more pure runners, I would say, in that regard, which can get you an extra 25 or 30 fantasy points, which can be the difference between being running back 1 and running back 4.
Sure. But a guy that's currently going as running back 11.
Yeah, no,
I think we all, anyway, so all in on Christian McCaffrey. Run CMC, baby.